Next, from Springfield, we talked to Kyle Thomas, Director of Voter Registration Services for the State Board of Elections, about election audits, preventing voter fraud, and whether the state's policy of allowing illegal aliens to obtain driver's licenses could lead to illegal voting, should the state adopt a proposed policy of a driver's license as proof of citizenship. Later, we take a tour with Mr. Thomas of new voting machines soon to be used in Illinois elections. This runs about 30 minutes.
Kyle Thomas with the State Board of Elections. Thanks for joining us on the Illinois Channel.
Thanks for having me, Terry.
We wanted to, as we go into 2016, just take a look behind the scenes of what you do and how do we know that our elections are being run in a manner in which everyone would expect them to be, above board, that their vote matters, that their vote is counted properly. Relative to that, what is your function and what is, as far as regulating elections, what is it the State Board of Election does?
Well, the State Board of Elections has a lot of duties for elections. Specifically for myself, there are two parts to my division. The first part is our statewide voter registration database. We were required under the federal 2002 Help America Vote Act to create and maintain a statewide voter registration database that assigns unique identifiers to every registrant, helps to eliminate duplicate registrations for individuals, removed deceased individuals from the rolls. One part of my division...
Can I interject that? You just said
Yes.
to underscore that, because that was a question I was going to ask.
Okay.
Remove deceased individuals from the rolls.
Yes.
We'll see periodically, everyone's read this, where there's some article and it's like, any number of dead people had voted. How is that possible, number one? And two, relative to dead people voting, obviously someone's committing fraud. Is there any kind of follow-up to prosecute those who may or may not have been engaged, or were engaged, I should say, in the voting fraud?
Well, a couple things there. The investigations that we've done for the potentially deceased people voting, most of the time it ends up being a junior-senior situation where a son has the same name as the father is deceased, the son continues to vote. Sometimes the father's voting record, the registration for the father, gets wrongfully selected to have the history applied to it from the election. So son walks into the polling place, says, "I'm Kyle Thomas." The election judge pulls the Kyle Thomas that they see. "Are you Kyle Thomas at this address?" "Yes, I am." Just so happened that the father was at the same address while he was living. That individual, the father's record, ends up getting the voter history assigned to it, and in fact, and then the son's record does not get the history. So you'll see history for the son, and then it switches over, and all of a sudden the father who's deceased now has voting history. It shows that that this deceased individual is actually voting, when in fact it's not the case. The case is that the son is actually voting, and they legally have the right to do so. It's just that there was a paper trail error by an election judge.
When I've gone up to vote, sometimes they'll ask me to show a driver's license that my signature matches the one on the record. I mean, some kind of a verification that I am who I say I am. Mm-hmm. Is that standard practice? Do you, as the election boards, tell the individual judges, election judges, at least through their training, when every time a voter comes up to vote, this is the procedure you should follow, or is it at the discretion of the individual judges?
Well, the judges are instructed either by our staff. We do have staff that provides election judge training. The state offers that to the election jurisdictions free of charge. In those instructions, or if the jurisdictions have chosen to do their own instructions for the judges, those judges would be told that they need to do a signature comparison. So you are asked to sign what's called a ballot application. They have their poll books, they're called, and on the poll book it has your signature from your voter registration card, and they do a signature comparison of that ballot application against your voter registration.
When you, let me just throw out, one of the things is, speaking of election judges, these are on one hand volunteers, but they're also paid, are they not?
Yes, they are.
Who pays those judges, and approximately, does it vary how much they make by location? Where does the money come from? Not only for the judges, where does the money come from to run an election?
Generally, the money comes from general revenue funds, the election jurisdictions themselves.
Of the state of Illinois, or?
No, of the election jurisdictions.
Okay.
In Illinois, there are 109 election jurisdictions. Most of those are counties and county-based or county clerks. There are some election commissioners. There are city election commissioners, and there are now 2 county board election commissions. The majority of the funding and money for elections comes from the local tax base. As in regards to the election judges, the state does reimburse election jurisdictions for election judge.
Is it the same salary across the state, or does it vary by locale?
The state reimburses at the same rate across the state, although jurisdictions are allowed to kick in more money for different locations. If they have the available funds to do so, they may choose to do that.
Not that I want to spend all the time on election judges, but since some people might say, hey, I wouldn't mind being an election judge and making X number of dollars a day, what does it
Yeah.
pay, and how long do they work?
I don't remember the exact rate offhand. It's generally around $100 for the day. It's a minimum, it's at least a 13-hour day. The polls are open from 6 a.m. to 7 p.m. They are expected to get there ahead of time to get the polls open, get them ready for voting.
So they might have to get there at 5 a.m. or something
Yes,
like that.
and then they are expected to stay until all business is conducted within the polling place, and then a pair of judges, both one from each party, will return the results back to the election authority. For anybody who's interested in becoming an election judge, they definitely need to get a hold of their local election jurisdiction, their election authority. That contact information is on our website.
We hear so much just about the state of Illinois having financial difficulties and any number of people not getting the money they need. Relative to running an election, let's just take, we had a special election with State Senator Darren LaHood being elected to Congress. How expensive is it to put on an election? And I'm sure everything varies, but are there instances where we have counties that just say, you know, we can't afford to put on the election. Well, we don't have any money left in the till to to incur the costs?
Fortunately, we haven't gotten to a situation where the jurisdiction just cannot do it. Generally what happens is they have to rob Peter to pay Paul, and they will have to take funds from another earmarked for another
Something
priority.
was going to go to the highway fund, they do to have the election or something like that.
Yes. It's not cheap to have elections. There is programming that has to be done. The tabulation equipment has to be programmed and set up in order to tabulate correctly, to have those names available of the selections for the voters when they walk in. They have to pay judges, as we said. The state does reimburse for those judges, but the state only reimburses for election day polling place judges. There is early voting, grace period voting that the state does not provide reimbursement for.
Let's talk, I mean, there's any number of issues, and we can't have the time to get into everything, but let's just talk a bit about voting fraud. That's always an issue that people are concerned about. And interestingly, in Illinois, we, of course, on one hand, always have allegations of voting fraud, but we also have had, over the last 10 years, some extremely close elections. I'm reminded of Senator Dillard running for governor and losing the nomination to State Senator Bill Brady by 198 votes or so, if I recall. When you have an election that close, and every vote, I mean, we say anyway every vote counts, but every vote really counts when it comes down to that margin of difference. Do you do anything differently? Do you come in and try to do an audit of the election to make sure that every vote has been counted, or in those procedures, what happens?
In those situations, we don't do anything any different. Audits are conducted for every election. There is pre-election testing that's done by the election jurisdictions, the election authorities themselves. Prior to every election, they test every piece of equipment. They then, after the election, do what's called a 5% retabulation. Those results, they review.
What does that do?
In a 5% retabulation, for all precincts that use what's known as in-precinct tabulation, the jurisdiction after the after the election and after they've tabulated the results for that election, and before the proclamation of results, so before any results are official, they do take 5% of the precincts, which the State Board of Elections is tasked with making that random selection of those precincts. They take the ballots from those precincts and they rerun them back through the machine and retabulate, check the results against election night to make sure that they came out the same. They also do the same thing for early voting equipment, so 5% of
So
all.
you would take ballots that were, as an example, 1,000 votes for candidate Smith and 900 votes for candidate Jones, rerun them through just to make sure it tabulated the same way?
That's correct.
Okay. Do you find much of a variance when you do these audits?
No, there's very little variance. When investigated, there's sometimes situations where instead of the individual fully darkening the oval in an optical scan ballot situation, they may have put an X that, depending on the orientation, meaning the direction that the ballot was fed into the machine, it may have caught it one time and didn't catch it the next time.
So voters beware, color within the lines.
Yes, please follow the directions. The instructions are very clear to completely darken the oval, and that is important. The machines are dependent upon that.
One of the issues that comes up too is, are we getting illegal aliens voting in elections? There has been a proposal by Senator Andy Menard, I believe it's SB 2134, that as Illinois, to remind viewers, allows illegal aliens now to have a driver's license. The proposal of Senator Menard, the proposed legislation, not law yet, would allow for automatic registration to vote when you get a driver's license. Would that not open the door for illegal aliens to be voting in Illinois elections?
It depends on how the law is actually drafted and what becomes implemented. Right now, we are at a draft. There is some
A draft of the
the
legislation.
draft of the legislation. There is some details that need to be worked out. Most certainly, the issue of citizenship needs to be addressed as the individual is registering or as they are getting their driver's license. That question does need to come up. The state of Oregon has
I know you're a nonpartisan arm of government, but when a piece of legislation comes up, you may or may not have that impacts elections, as this would. Do you take a position on that legislation? Do you voice your opinion as an organization to the lawmakers and say, we have a problem with this legislation as it's drafted?
Well, the State Board of Elections themselves, and just to clarify, I'm a staff member of the State Board of Elections. The State Board of Elections will sometimes take a position on a bill. Oftentimes, the legislation is reviewed by staff here at the State Board of Elections, and recommendations or suggestions are brought forth to just to help with the implementation. We definitely take a nonpartisan position, but we try to answer the question that if this is what the legislature wants to do, this is how they could actually do it.
Have any other states had similar piece of legislation?
I am aware that the state of Oregon has implemented a similar bill. Just as recently as last week, the state of California also signed into law a similar proposal. I do know that in the state of Oregon, in order to get a driver's license, you are required to provide proof of citizenship in order to get that driver's license.
What kind of proof would be requested?
I don't know if it's just a birth certificate, or I don't know all the documents that are required, but they've made it very clear that they do require proof of citizenship in order to get that driver's license.
And again, on this proposal, has 2134, has the State Board of Elections taken a position on it yet, or?
No, they have not.
When you do have a concern, not you specifically, but I mean, the State Board of Elections has a concern on legislation, to whom do they speak? Do they go to the bill sponsor? Do they go to the governor's office? I mean, who within state government would they voice their opinion?
It varies depending on the situation. The board would definitely reach out to the sponsor. From the staff level, we reach out to legislative staffers, ones that are working on the crafting of the language, to just bring up concerns that we may have with the way things are currently drafted.
When you look at other states? I presume you touch base with your counterparts in other states just to kind of keep tabs on what they're doing and what problems they're having, what successes they're having. How would you assess elections in Illinois relative to other states? Are we where we should be? Are we behind where we should be? And in whatever way you want to designate it.
I'd like to think that we're ahead in some aspects. I don't think we're behind in any certain areas. We're definitely, some of the recent legislation that's come out is ahead in some aspects, ahead of what other states are doing. This SB 2134 is one of those situations where Illinois is looking at not only maybe not being ahead, but being out in front. As far as the elections as a whole, I think we do a very good job here in Illinois. We definitely take things seriously.
I want to take, if we might, a look at some equipment. You could explain to us, because
Yeah.
you evaluate the equipment, how that works. But just before we do, when we look at an election, we'll have coming up a general election in 2116, what is the approximate cost of something like that? Do you know?
I don't have the figures in front of me, Terry. I do know that, I mean, speaking to the equipment, there is, like I mentioned for the special election, there is a lot of programming. The jurisdictions have to program the equipment itself. They have to enter those names. They have to create paper ballots. They have to send those ballots out for absentee voters. It's not cheap.
Are they sending the results in now? Everything's been impacted by the internet. Are they sending the results in via the internet, or how do they report? You know, if we're having a Senate race, or in other words, a statewide election, how do you get those votes in so we know who's ahead during the course of the evening?
Well, during the evening, those results aren't shared with the State Board of Elections. The State Board of Elections finalizes and makes finalizes the results from the proclamation of
So that's more the news organizations, I guess, tabulating those.
Yes, that's more the media, keeping tabs, talking with the jurisdictions, the election authorities themselves as results are brought in.
Okay.
And those are definitely unofficial results. In the State Board of Elections, we don't get involved with the unofficial results.
Yeah, you verify that.
But as far as electronic transmission, we do now have in place what's called our e-canvas, an electronic canvas, and the jurisdictions do use our statewide registration database because it is a web-based tool and a web-based portal with the election jurisdictions. They do use that tool to get the official canvas to the State Board of Elections for that proclamation of results.
Okay. Well, I know that, like everything, the technology is changing. Let's see if we might take a look at some equipment and how you evaluate that.
Yeah, no problem, Terry. So part of what we do here at the State Board of Elections is we test voting equipment and vote tabulation equipment. In order for any equipment to be used in the state of Illinois, it does first have to receive board approval from the State Board of Elections. And prior to board approval, staff reviews the equipment and conducts tests on the equipment. And we have here one of the pieces of equipment that's currently being looked at and being considered by staff for board approval. It has not yet received board approval. It's not yet in use here in Illinois. But this is one piece of equipment by a vendor. This would be an ADA compliant piece where individuals with disabilities would be able to use this. It does have items that can plug into it for headphones. It can also has keypad device that can be plugged into it. But this is what's known as an electronic ballot marking device. With this, the election judge would punch in a key code, and we have some sample codes here I can show you. But we would punch in a key code, and this would be the code for the precinct and the ballot style for the voter to be able to use. We have a set of instructions that would come up. There are several pages of instructions that the voter can scroll through, read the instructions, be informed on how to use this piece of equipment. And then when they're ready, they can hit the button to start voting. The electronic equipment clearly shows them the number of vote fors. It will not allow them to overvote in an office. Once they select the number of vote fors, the rest of the choices are grayed out. So they can go through and make their selections on the piece of equipment. As shown here, it does allow for a write-in. You can make your selection.
Let me ask, when you are looking at new equipment like this, what is the, what are you looking for? What kind of, and why even consider new equipment if the current equipment is doing the job?
Like all technology, things get aged out. Newer technology comes along. Equipment gets old and outdated, needs to be replaced eventually. The way that the law works in Illinois is the vendor or those that are wishing to bring a new piece of equipment makes a request, makes application for approval with the State Board of Elections. We review their approval. We start the process. We review their application. In Illinois, we do require, in order for the board to approve the equipment, it has to have first gone through a VISTL, which is a voting systems testing lab from the federal level. It has to be an approved VSTL, approved by the federal government, the EAC. And the equipment has to be tested to the voting system standards that are put out or promulgated by the EAC.
What are some of the standards that would be a voting machine would have to meet?
There are, I mean, it's pages and pages of requirements. Some of those things are that the code base meets the requirements, protection against hacking, protection against unwanted threats. There are other levels of testing that the VISTL does as far as not only do they run ballots and check for proper tabulation, they also do environmental tests on the equipment to make sure that it can handle different levels of storage, different temperatures. They do drop tests on the equipment to make sure that that it'll still function after certain requirements of different shock. Our level of testing here doesn't have those types of drop tests and environmentals. We focus more on compliance with state statute, state rules, also with obviously functionality, how easy it is to use, if it is something that would be able to be used by voters easily, understood by the election judges that are the ones that are overseeing the process out in the polling places. We also most definitely check for tabulation accuracy. Another one of those federal standards which we look for.
If I might, let me, one of the stories that we heard from the 2012 election is that people would be voting for one candidate and another candidate's name would come up. I'm sure you've heard some of that. What accounts for that? And if that's the case, how can we have faith in electronic voting?
What we've seen in those situations, Terry, is that the calibration for the actual touch screen device has been off. These machines, they are an older level of technology as far as the touchscreen than what people are getting used to with iPhones and Samsung touch devices. They don't have that level of sensitivity. They are actually a touch screen. So they do have to be calibrated. And
so we might, if I can demonstrate, we might say that here's a person's name, and I might want to vote for that person, let's say by touching it with whatever device. On the other hand, if the sensitivity of the screen is too broad, it might assign the vote to the other candidate.
yes, that is possible. And if the calibration is off, it is possible that if you touch on one person's name, it will indicate a vote for another person. There are many safeguards through the process against that, even in the situations we've had that have come up during elections. I'll show you here when we get to the end. At no time, even if the wrong selection is chosen, you are always given a review screen. And on that review screen, you can clearly see if the proper choice has been selected on your behalf. And then with those are DRE devices that have been used in the past. With those, they use what's called a verified voter paper trail. and there's actually a device hanging off the side of the machine that when the person's ready to cast their vote, and actually prior to that, part of the review summary, they actually review that verified paper trail. So it prints their selections on the piece of paper, allows the individual to select or to review those selections prior to casting their vote. And once they cast their vote, what becomes, the machine tallies the votes, but after the election, there is what's called 5% retabulation done across the state for all in-precinct voting devices and 5% of all early voting machines. And jurisdictions actually go through those verified voter paper trails, and those are what the retabulation is done against. So it's a check against the recording of the electronic machine and the tabulation that it's done. There's a hand check against the paper that the voter was able to verify against. Now in the situation with this machine, once you've verified everything, and it'll clearly, if you have an undervote, it would indicate in red. It won't allow you to overvote. In this case, all selections are fine. There's no overs or unders. In this situation, this is a ballot marking device. It actually creates a paper ballot that then can be reviewed again by the voter with names, the candidates and their punch numbers or selection numbers, and then this barcode at the bottom, and this barcode and this series of dots at the bottom is what the tabulator actually tabulates. So this piece of equipment here is not actually a tabulator, it is a ballot marking device. So the voter would then, after being satisfied with this, would then take and insert this into a tabulator, and that's what would tabulate the results.
Do all voting machines used in the state of Illinois have to print out a paper ballot?
All voting machines in Illinois do have to have a verified voter paper trail, either like I demonstrated here with a ballot marking device, or in what's called a DRE, or a direct recording electronic device, where the device itself is the tabulator. There is a verified voter paper trail that the individual voter can look at, review their selections, those get saved, and for any retabulation testing that's done and any recounts that are done, it's the paper trail that is actually used for that purpose.
And currently, who pays for the equipment? Is it paid for by the state, or just who pays for the new voting equipment?
All equipment is paid for by the local election jurisdictions. Here in Illinois, we have 109 election authorities across the state. Most of those are county clerks, but we also have Board of Election Commissioners in several locations. Many of those are cities, such as the city of Chicago is its own election jurisdiction. Cook County is a separate election jurisdiction. So people that live outside of the city of Chicago, their election jurisdiction would be Cook County. Those election jurisdictions themselves are the ones that purchase the equipment and pay for it, maintain it, and implement use of it on election day.
And where do they get their money to pay for these equipment? Is there some kind of a user tax, or does it come out of general revenue funds? Or?
Generally comes out of their general revenue fund. In the past, there was what was known as HAVA, the Help America Vote Act of 2002, did pay for a lot of the equipment that's in use currently in Illinois. That was a federal bill that had grant funds available to the election jurisdictions to be able to pay for and purchase new equipment.
And how it's going to vary like anything, just like buying cars, it's going to vary in price. What is the approximate cost of a voting machine?
Machines like this are typically $3,000 to $5,000 a piece. The numbers of machines per jurisdiction definitely varies. It's based on the number of precincts they have, the number of voters they have that requires the number of precincts. But it's generally, they are several $1,000s a piece.
And we know from a financial standpoint, the state has been in a financial problem for some time now. As we look around the state, are we keeping up with current technology, or are we woefully behind?
I wouldn't say we're woefully behind. We have just now approved some newer equipment for use here in Illinois. Just within, I think it was at our September board meeting, was the first new piece of equipment brought to us by a vendor for approval in about 9 years. So the state has kept up with what's been available to them up to this point, but we are getting to a point where many jurisdictions are looking at considering new equipment. The stuff that they have is getting to be 10 or more years old at this point, so it's definitely something that's on the horizon that many jurisdictions are going to have to be purchasing new equipment.
You're well aware of the reputation of Chicago. We sometimes joke, vote early, vote often. If the technology is, as you say, if it's foolproof, are we still suffering voter fraud in places like Cook County?
Well, Terry, nothing's foolproof, obviously. I believe that, City of Chicago, as well as Cook County, they do a very good job of maintaining the elections, overseeing the elections. The technology definitely assists them in that process to make sure that everything, when a voter casts their vote, that vote is counted. The City of Chicago, just like any other jurisdiction, they conduct their own pre-testing, they conduct post-testing, they conduct retabulation, 5% across the entire state. We review those retabulation results here at the State Board of Elections, and we're not seeing the signs of fraud that are concerns. Like we had brought up the issue with the touchscreens being out of calibration. There's been some news stories about those. I know in the City of Chicago there was even, I believe it was a state rep candidate, had brought up a concern. He even admitted to the media that he was able to cast his vote for the candidates that he wanted. He just had there was some calibration issues where he had to touch the screen a little further towards one name than the other to get his selection.
Kyle Thomas, thank you.
Thank you, Terry.